My name's Tommy Tallarico. I've been a video game composer for over 22 years, and I started Video Games Live, a touring video game show about, that was in 2002, we started that, and I've been on some shitty TV shows on G4, and actually our shows weren't too shitty, it was G4 that was shitty. Not my fault. But anyway, we're here at the Classic Gaming Expo, so I thought it'd be cool to talk about classic video game music and how we used to do things way back when. It was definitely different than the way we do things now, for sure. So let me see. When I got involved in the industry, does it work now? Yeah. Check this out. I'm not this tall. Oh, there it is. So I'm going to just go by hand there. Very small. Yeah, when I got involved, late 80s, early 90s, I had started working on the NES, Game Boy, and we were doing some PC stuff for like floppy, Apple II we were still working on, and a Macintosh. And I didn't come from a programmer background, because most of the cats who were doing game audio back then were basically computer programmers. So they would, they were literally, with music, there's like a note number. It's all mathematics, right? So it's a note number on the keyboard. It's how hard you press down on the key. That's the velocity or the volume. And there's how long you pressed on the key. So the note, the note length. And when you, took your finger off the keyboard. And that was pretty much, that's mathematically music, right? And so back then, people were programming music, by hand, typing stuff into the keyboard, like, okay, note 77, we'll make the values like between, 0 and 128 or 127. We'll make that 64. That value, that's length, and this and that. So that's why a lot of the video game music, back then sounded kind of very mechanical and this and that, because people were, typing music. I mean, how do you type the blues? That's, you can't do that. And there's always a big debate. People always ask me, do you like music from back in the 80s and 90s? It's like way better than the music nowadays, isn't it? And to me, I'm going to be very honest, to me I would say they're both really good. I don't think one is better than the other. I know a lot of people are like, oh, that's crap. See, what people don't remember, people remember the Marios, Tetris, Zelda, Castlevania, Metroid, Mega Man. We all love and remember those. Those are all the great, some of the best, greatest video game melodies ever written for our time. But there was a lot of shit out there too, and we all tend to forget the shit. So 95% of the stuff that was out there was really bad. And the same could be said nowadays as well. There's a lot of crap out there, but we still, in this generation as well, have the Halos and the Metal Gear Solids and the Final Fantasies, and the music these days isn't too bad either. So I don't think one is better or worse than the other. I think they're equal, but they're different. But one of the things that was the most important thing when doing music back then, because it didn't matter if we had live orchestras or choirs or electric guitars and drummers or whatever, licensed music, anything, it didn't matter. Back then, it was all about melody. And that's one of the things I always tell composers who are doing music nowadays, or upcoming composers, is it's still all about melody. That's the most important thing. So when you take a game like Mario, or a Zelda, or a Tetris, it all had great melody. Didn't matter if they had a live orchestra, or a guitar, or just a little tiny, one-channel PSG voice, And so melody is always the most important thing when creating video game music. It's the thing that people are going to remember. I mean, back then, we only had maybe, take a game like Sonic the Hedgehog. Each song, all 10 levels, were 45 seconds in length. That was it, and then they looped, right? That's all you had. Now, all the music in Sonic was great, every one of it, because it had that great melody. But Anyway, backing up, even before Sonic, when we would do, so when I first kind of came in the industry, I wasn't a programmer. I mean, I had programmed, you know, I think any kid growing up in the 80s, you know, I was programming like, you know, in BASIC, you know, like, you know, dirty text adventures and things like that, but, you know, so I kind of understood what programming was about. I understood kind of the philosophy behind it, but I couldn't, like, you know, blow code in assembly or C++ or anything like that, right? But I understand, okay, 10, go to this, and put a string, I got it, okay, it's all good. So, but I never programmed in my video game career as a professional. What I did is I would sit down with the programmers and say, okay, what are you, you know, what do you need from the music? And again, it was, what's the note number? How long is the note? And even in the early things, we didn't even have note velocity. We didn't even have note volume. So it was just the note and the length of it, and that's it. And around the same time, MIDI had kind of been invented and implemented, and MIDI is a musical instrument digital interface. That's what MIDI stands for. And what it was is basically on a synthesizer or a keyboard, there was a MIDI cable, and it was basically zeros and ones, just digital information of exactly what I just spoke about. You know, what note, how long are you holding it for, how hard did you hit it, and it was all values between, you know, 1 and 128, you know, 0 to 128, 7, 8, whatever, I forget, 30 years ago. So anyway, and so I sat down with the programmers and I said, well, couldn't you take, if I could take this information out of the keyboard and plug it directly into the machine. See, all these machines had a sound chip, just like they all had graphic chips and this and that. They had little sound chips. So whether it was the FM synthesis of the Genesis, or the 8-voice kind of sample channel of the Super Nintendo, or the 3 PSG voices of the Game Boy and the NES with 1 white noise channel for percussion, they all had sound chips. So what I did is I had programmers build me systems that enabled my keyboard, my MIDI keyboard, to jack right into the sound chip on the platform. And that gave me a completely unfair advantage over everybody else who was doing this in the industry at the time. But even before that, the first game I worked on was the original Prince of Persia. And it was funny because when we had done Prince of Persia, a lot of people, you know, the producers and designers came to me and they said, well, you know, we want to do, you know, we have 13 levels in the game or whatever the hell it was, and so just make like 1-minute songs looping in 13 different ones. And I'm like, but why? And they said, well, that's what video games do. That's what you do. When you go into the level, you start the music, and when you end, you beat the level song, you know? And I thought, I just didn't see, when I was playing Prince of Persia, I saw those beautiful animations. And I'm like, and you know, and they wanted music that was, you know, kind of like merry-go-round children's music. And I said, but it's like a Middle Eastern thing, and we can use different, you know, chord progressions and you know, melodic things. Just because I don't necessarily have a, you know, a snake charming flute doesn't mean that I can still have that same kind of vibe with, you know, the different chord patterns and the different keys that I can go in musically. I can still make it sound Arabian and Middle Eastern. And why does there have to be music all the time? I think it takes away from it. Let's make, again, because it had like a little cutscene cinematics, and it was kind of this cool storyline going on, and these beautiful animations. I said, why don't we have like no music, and then when things happen in the game, whether he pulls out his sword, he drinks a potion, when he dies, when he opens a door, during these cinematics, when he meets the, you know, an enemy or the princess or the, you know, whatever the hell the bad guy's name was. why don't we trigger music at those points? You know, it's a very different way of approaching a video game, kind of platform video game like that. And people argued with me. I mean, we had yelled, you know, screaming matches, you know, saying, that's not the way video games are made. And I'm like, well, great, good. Why do they have to be, who says they have to be made like this? So, so anyway, so that was kind of an approach. And then I won a bunch of awards for Prince of Persia, so they had to shut up. So that was good news. They had to listen to me. And they made me the full-time music guy, because I was actually a game tester. I was hired as a games tester, and then I would bug the vice president of the company every day, please let me do music, I'll do it for free, and if you don't like it, you don't have to use it. So I got lucky on that. But you know, back then, this is before I had the MIDI system too. What I would do it was literally, when you say, you know, people talk about zeros and ones, it's digital. It literally was zeros and ones. I mean, I would, in order to create a sound for the NES or the Game Boy, I had a chart of like 64 squares, and you either had to put a 0 or a 1 in there. And that was all you had, a 0 or a 1. And the different boxes, and I used to do it on paper, and the different boxes, this is how, to create what the sound sounded like. So it was like a sine wave or a sawtooth wave, just different like things like that. And if you made this 1 instead of a 0, it would kind of go ooh. And then if you, oh shit, what if I do 2 1s in a row? And it was kind of like ooh. Like, wow, making music, this is fantastic. So you would literally sit there for days and days, just randomly tweaking zeros and ones, and it's like, yeah, that kind of sounds like a flute now or something, you know. And I would literally have sheets and sheets of paper, and then you would give that paper to the programmer, and he'd sit there and go 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, and you know, and then you'd have to double check his work, and then he'd compile the game. And that took like 45 minutes. And then he'd come back and like, yeah, that sounds like crap. Let me do that again. Let me change this one to a 0 and a 1. And then you give him that. Oh my God. So it went on and on. And then from the music standpoint, so they used like ASCII files. And what I had them do is I would say, well, why don't you take my MIDI file? Because they were just coming out with these sequencers, music sequencers for PC. So I was using Cakewalk 1.0 for DOS, which was basically what it would do is it would record MIDI information into a PC. I had like an IBM PS2 kind of weird thing. It was like a Mac kind of. The screen was in the monitor and everything, but like a laptop. Hey, anyway, so we would basically we would take them. So I would write these MIDI files and the sequencer, save them as a MIDI file, and then we'd port them to an ASCII file, which is again basically zeros and one, and you would just get a paragraph of numbers. It would spit out a paragraph of numbers. And the problem would be is that when you would, you know, a typical keyboard is 88 notes across. And so, but when you would go out of range, just because a piano has 88 notes doesn't mean the system knew what the hell 88 notes were. So there was definitely like a range that you could only go in. And so when I would play and I would play too high, it would just totally crash the system, you know, just like, what the hell is this? Ah, and it would freak out, and you get this high-pitched sound or just digital crap. It was excellent. I think Nine Inch Nails uses a lot of that stuff in their music, actually. But so it would freak out, and the system would crash, and you'd have to figure out what the hell happened. Oh, I used a note out of range. Damn. Let me bring that whole phrase down an octave or two, or if you would hold a note for too long, it didn't like that. So you know, so to get any kind of long notes, you really couldn't have long notes. Like, so you would have to kind of go, you know, if you wanted one note that was just going like da, it's kind of like maybe as a counter melody or something. You couldn't do da. You'd have to do like da 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 And again, this is why some of the music was like, you know, all kind of sounded, you know, kind of very syncopated and very, you know, kind of, you know, to the beat all the time, because you had to, you couldn't have long notes, basically. And then you had other things too, like attack and decay, sustain. What that means is, again, these are the zeros and ones you would mess with. So if you had like, instead of when you would hit a note, it'd be like really hard. So it'd be like, beep, you know, but if you mess with some of the zeros and ones, it could actually fade in. So it's kind of like, kind of like almost like a violin or a string. Oh, that's cool. And same thing with decay. When you took your finger off, it would go, instead of just stopping, it would go like, you know, and it would kind of like fade away. A nice little reverb tone almost to it. But the thing you always had to be careful of is you only had 4 voices back then. And I'm talking NES Game Boy right now, right? 4 voices, that's all you got. So that means, and so they could never overlap over each other. You can never have more than 4. So, for example, in music, if you do a chord, right, that's like 3, you know, like a chord, like a C chord, you have 3 notes that make up that one chord. Well, that's your whole music system gone right there. 1 chord, you're done. And then, like I said, you have this white noise channel, which you kinda, it was either or, and that was it. So that kind of sounds like drums and a hi-hat, kind of. Yeah, it's a snare and a kick, sure. And so you would kind of mess with that for percussion, and then you had 3 notes, so they could never overlap. So you were always kind of cautious about, you know, how you use those 3 notes when they happened and how you had to happen. Oh yeah, and we had sound effects as well. Damn it! So now you can go back and listen to Mario and realize what a genius Koji Kondo was, because that's all he had, you know? And you had those amazing sound effects as well with the music. And when you did stuff like that, it was all about prioritizing as well. So I'd sit down with the programmer and say, because you didn't want to just play your music, because you wanted to use all the channels you had for music. You didn't want to leave one channel open just for sound effects. You'd be dead, because now you only have 2 notes, right? No, it's like, okay, at least I have 3 notes. But you always want to prioritize stuff, so when a sound effect would come in, that had to be the highest priority, right? And so you had to drop out one of the things. So you had to figure out, well, which one of these 3 do I want to drop out? So you had to be very careful when you put each of these 3 things on their own channel. You know, you had to prioritize, okay, I want the middle one of that chord to drop out, because that's not as important, and the sound effects will cover it anyway. So it was, so again, back then, it wasn't about, it didn't take you a long time creating the song. Sometimes, because you only had a couple of notes to work with, sometimes you do a song in, you know, a couple minutes, or, you know, maybe a day. But it took you 3 weeks, 4 weeks, sometimes a month, to get it to sound good, you know, to get it to sound like something. That was the challenge back then. Now, doing game music, the challenge is now it's so, you have so much production value and this and that. It's like now you're like recording live orchestras and going to a studio and mixing and mastering and blah, 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 and making it all interactive. So now it's like even more crazy. And of course, now you don't have 10, 45-second songs. You have like, I was just talking to Russell Brower, who's the audio director and composer from Blizzard, and he's just wrapping up Mists of Pandaria. He had like 6 hours of unique live recorded music for that game. I mean, it's insane. But, so, you know, again, both eras had its challenges. But the thing, like I said, the thing back then was the voices and working intelligently. Then when the Sega Genesis came along, now we had 6 voices to work with. And they were FM synthesis, like the Yamaha DX7, which was a popular keyboard in the 80s. And FM synthesis was more like that kind of punchy synth sound, right? And the cool thing about it, like I said, it was more like a synthesizer. So it wasn't bleeps and bloops. It was kind of like this analog synth thing. And that's when we got, you know, we were able to get the MIDI plug right into that FM chip. And so I could play the Genesis on my keyboard and hear what it would sound like. And then record that to this, record the notes and sequences and things that I was playing as a sequencer, and then use that file and download it into the Genesis, and then they would then play that back. And I could literally assign priorities to every sound effect in every channel. The cool thing that the Genesis had, though, was that out of those 6 channels, you could actually use one of them as a sample channel. So only one of them could be a sample, and it was really crappy, you know, scratchy. The problem with the sample channel is, back then it was all about space as well. So when you had a cartridge, everybody was fighting for space, whether it was the programmer for code, the artists were taking, they were the biggest hogs. They would take all the cartridge space for their graphics. And then audio was always like an afterthought back then, you know, and that was one of the things that I really wanted to kind of change. That was, you know, in films, audio is post-production, right? So they make the film, they have to cut the scene together, then give it to the audio guys to put sound effects and music on. So that was kind of their mentality. But with video games, they're so much different because, again, we have to carve out space, we have to carve out the technology. Are we streaming in the music at the beginning of the level? Is it happening during the level while something else is loading and this and that? So, you know, I really wanted to change the way people felt and thought about video game music. And I knew if I could get more space on that cartridge, I could use more samples, my music could be longer, it could start to sound like legitimate stuff, and that wasn't happening a lot back then. So I was lucky enough to work with some great teams in the early 90s. David Perry, who went on to form Shiny Entertainment, and then formed Gaikai, which they just sold to Sony a couple weeks ago. That's pretty much invented the whole cloud gaming thing. Him and On Live kind of doing it separately, but David was, you know, programmer back then, and we first, as a team, there was a group of about 10 of us who worked on Global Gladiators together on the Genesis. Then we moved to Cool Spot on the Super Nintendo and Genesis, same team. Then did Aladdin on the Genesis, which was the #1 selling game, I think in 93 or 94. And then we went on to do Earthworm Jim together. And again, we always fought for bigger cartridge sizes. So we would go to the president of Virgin or Sega or whoever we were working for at the time and say, look, we want as much space as possible. We know it costs more to manufacture the game, but the payoff is going to be so much more because, you know, people are gonna enjoy the experience more, you know. And so we were always able to, and we would always do demos. I'd do demos with music, say, hey, check it what it sounds like if I had this space. And so I would use samples, back then people would only use samples for like, you know, once or twice a game because they didn't have the space. So it'd be like, go, you know, start, you know, fight, you know, that way, and that was about it. But because I had so much more space, I was able to, I would thrash the shit out of that sample channel. I wanted samples going on every second of the time, and I would just prioritize them. So I would do a kick and a snare as a sample instead of, you know, instead of that crappy sound. I would actually record a kick and a snare. And then when a sound effect came in of a voice or a collection of a token or whatever, you know, it would knock out that sample channel, but everything else was covering it, so it was okay. So priority, I just constantly wanted to thrash that sample channel at all times. And then when the Super Nintendo came around, now you had 8 channels, but they were all sample channels, every single one of them. So that was kind of cool. So like when ActRaiser came out, if you guys remember when like ActRaiser first hit and you kind of heard those strings in the beginning and it was kind of like this pseudo-orchestral sound, you're like, oh my gosh, it was like so amazing, right? And so that had its advantages and disadvantages as well. The Genesis had a much beefier kind of analog sound to it because it had that FM chip. The Super Nintendo had a more realistic sound, but it was really kind of missing that low end and that kind of, you know, bassy kind of analog thing because it was just 8 digital samples. And it was so funny because back in those days, the way, okay, so if you wanted to, everything was like controlled by Nintendo back then. So it still is on their systems, but back then it was really bad. And so if you wanted a sound for the Super Nintendo, what you had to do is you had to record a sound on a DAT tape, which was a digital audio tape, these little suckers, and they had machines and stuff back then. And you had to send that to Nintendo. The guy would then take that sound and he would loop it and then send it back to you maybe a couple months later. And then whatever he gave you, that's what you were stuck with. And and so you couldn't create your own sounds for the Super Nintendo. You had to go through Nintendo just to make a sound. And the name of the sound file, when it would come back, would be like whatever, violin1.sol, shit out of luck. That's what they called the file, because you couldn't create it yourself because it was all Nintendo had to, had all their priority stuff. So SOL files. If you ask anyone who programmed on the Super Nintendo, ask them what the audio files were called. They're the SOL files. So that was just awful, right? So you had to, so it was kind of hard. And of course, Nintendo always had the best samples that they would never share with anyone else. So, when Super Mario World, it was like, oh my God, it was so awesome, and they had banjos and so many great sounds. Like, hey, can we get those sounds? Like, no. So, okay, but here's my banjo sound. It would come back and it would sound like shit. So, yes, I was SOL. So that was always, that had a set of challenges as well too. And the thing to remember is all these systems had completely new and different hardware platforms, had all completely new audio systems. So once a new audio platform came out, you had to start from scratch. You had to, and the programmers had to create, they're called audio drivers. And they were all terrible because, they weren't really audio guys who were programming them. They were just programmers. And there would be, for each system, there'd be about 4 or 5 different audio drivers floating around, and they were all ass. And so it was just a matter of, rolling up your sleeves, getting your hands dirty, and trying to figure out, trying to make something sound right. And then, oh, can I get pitch bend in? And sometimes you could get pitch bend, and that was all really crazy and weird, and downloading and compiling and getting into the code. I mean, it was a lot of waiting around, but back then you'd always play the game and, kind of make notes. Like, oh, okay, boy, this gunshot is too loud. So, okay, so I'd make a note of that. Okay, gunshot too loud. So next time when we would compile, go in and turn that volume from 96, let's turn it down to 90. And then I'd recompile. It's like, damn it, it's too loud still. Okay, make a note of that. Turn it down to 80. And then you put that in, it's like, shit, too soft. Damn it. So you'd have to, so it'd take 5 days to get one sound effect kind of the level where you did. And then when you put the music in, it's like, oh, now everything's too loud, So, so that was always a challenge. The drivers nowadays, it's amazing because you can play the game and have the sound effects right there, and actually the composer, the audio guy, can sit there and tweak it right as you're playing the game. So big difference, big difference. And we don't have to worry about any priorities now. You have massive amounts of channels. You can stream multiple streams. So I could record a live orchestra, and I could record the same song, 10 different arrangements of it. Maybe one's big, it has a choir, and one has big percussion, and I can actually mute each one of those channels and tell the programmer, hey, there's 100 guys on horseback coming to kick your ass with swords. Play this version, but when there's only 10 guys left, then play this version. I can mute the choirs, I can mute the this and that. So has come such a long way in such a short period of time. But anyway, so that's kind of the thing back then. I know we don't have a ton of time. If anyone has any questions, though, sure, right there.
Yeah, I was wondering. What would be your kind of favorite soundtrack or sound design from new games right now? And
favorite soundtrack from games now? Yeah. I thought from a soundtrack standpoint, from a creative standpoint, and a technical standpoint, and an interactive standpoint, over the last couple of years, Red Dead Redemption freaking unbelievable. I mean, I've never had, like, the way the music and the sound just drew you right back into the Old West. It was unbelievable. And what they were doing technology-wise was incredible. If you play that game and listen, you know, as guys start to get, you know, as there's more people or as the action's starting to get intense, they're adding in, you know, sometimes it might just start with a bass line, then it adds in other things are coming in, and it's just amazing. I mean, Rockstar, say what you will, but they do, I mean, when you put in a Rockstar game, you know one thing, it's going to sound amazing, whether it's LA Noire, Grand Theft Auto. I mean, they spend the time and dedication to make their games. And to me, Red Dead Redemption, again, technologically, you might not be able to hum any of the music, you know, but I mean, I'm a big Shadow of the Colossus fan, you know, big Metal Gear fan. It's kind of tapered off a little bit over the years, but soundtrack-wise, God of War, I thought was an amazing soundtrack. Skyrim last year was pretty intense. Jeremy Soule. So the stuff for Uncharted is pretty good. Anything that Nobuo Uematsu does from Final Fantasy, you know, anytime he does, you know, anything from that, he's the best of all time. So yeah, those are some of my favorites. Some of my favorites from way back when though, some classic stuff. Castlevania, I mentioned them all pretty much. Castlevania, Mega Man 2 and 3, Mario, all-time favorite of all time. Zelda stuff is really great. Street Fighter 2, I like some of the tracks from that. It's really, basically anything that appears in video games live, I've gone back and done all my favorites at this point. So we pretty much cover all those. But yeah, actually, I got a great trivia question, and the people in this room will appreciate this. I have a great trivia question. I don't have a prize though. Actually, wait, hold on. I might have a guitar pick from video games. Do I? Yes, I do. Okay. Actually, no, that's, what the hell's that? That's Steven Tyler's guitar pick. Okay, sorry, wait. How the hell did I get this? No, I don't have one. I thought I did. Never mind. Okay. Instead, I will tell you this. Okay. I'm going to give you the question. First person, I mean, it's hard to see, but first, just shout out if you know the answer. I mean, don't shout out the answer, just say, yo. Okay? Okay, here's the question. What was the very first video game ever to use and record a live symphony? A live orchestra. First video game ever.
Yo.
Okay, hit it.
Dragon's Lair?
Dragon's Lair, 1985? 1983? There you go, very good. A lot of people always they're thinking like Halo, is it Final Fantasy? They're thinking like, you know, late 80s, you know? But in fact, Dragon's Lair, because of the Laserdisc, Christopher Stone was the composer that had worked with Don Bluth and Gary Goldman on a number of other stuff. So they got Christopher Stone to do it, and yeah, the first video game to ever use live orchestra. There you go. How about this? What was the now this one is I've heard a couple different answers on this, but I'm pretty sure people argue about this one, but and maybe we will argue here now. But what was the very first video game to ever have a voice in it?
Yo.
Right there.
Journey?
Journey. Not what I heard. Okay. Did that have a voice in it?
I heard that there was like a cassette track in the...
I believe it is a cassette tape.
Yeah. A cassette tape. Oh, okay. Well, actually, Ralph Baer in the late '60s had he would have a cassette tape hooked up to his brown box. It was pretty cool. I saw that in his house, in his basement. It was insane. And he would give you instructions in his voice. It was pretty funny.
Gorf?
Gorf? No, that's what I thought.
Sinistar.
Berserk is another one I thought. Sinistar. Oh my God, that game scared the shit out of me. I still got nightmares about that game. No, it was actually, I heard, it was a home console game. It was a home console. One of the home consoles.
Brain surgeon?
No, that's Intellivision, right?
You talking to Odyssey?
It wasn't. No, it was an Intellivision game.
Baseball.
Baseball, exactly. Yeah, that's what I had heard. I mean, you're out. I mean, that was pretty hot back then. I was like, oh my God, it's talking. And that was 1979, I believe. So, yeah, pretty crazy. There might be some before that, but that's the kind of the one that everybody thinks was Intellivision baseball. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
What inspiration do you have when you have to do music for a really shitty game?
What inspiration do I have when I have to do music for a really shitty game? None whatsoever. Getting paid. That's my inspiration. Getting paid and getting the hell out of Dodge. Actually, I'll tell you a funny story. Probably one of the shittiest games I ever worked on. No, not one of the shittiest game I've ever worked on was on the NES. And just to give you an idea of how, like I was talking earlier about how they used to think of game audio. So the vice president of Virgin comes into my office. This was circa 1990, 91 or whatever. And he says, hey, I got this game for the NES and we got to submit it tomorrow. It doesn't have any audio. You got till 5 o'clock. We got to hit FedEx. So you have 5 o'clock. And I had never worked on an NES game before. So I had to learn a shitty driver, write music for this shitty game. And the game was called Color a Dinosaur. And awful game. And it came out after Mario Paint. Mario Paint was friggin' cool. And this thing, you couldn't even save your work. And it was just terrible. Look it up on YouTube. It's the funniest thing you've ever seen. It's just awful. We used to call it Color a Herpes Sore. That's what I got. And so the music in that was not my finest hour. But and what's funny is about 3 years ago, the cartridge that I used, because I always talk about how crappy Color Dinosaur is, and now it's kind of become a running joke. And so, you know, like game trailers, Screw Attack has done like a funny thing about Color Dinosaur. I think the Angry Video Game Nerd guy did something about Color Dinosaur. So it's kind of become this running joke now. But and so cartridges, if you can find a cartridge shrink wrapped of Color Dinosaur, they go for $800. Yeah, it's insane. I got about 10 of them in my house too. In fact, we saw one yesterday, a guy selling just the cartridge for like, what was he selling for? 150 bucks or something, just for the cartridge. And then when I do video games live, people come up to me after the show all the time and they'll have their Color Dinosaur card. They're like, I bought this just so you could sign it. It sucks, I know. I write on it, shittiest game ever, Tommy Tallarico. So that gives you an idea of that. But yeah, inspiration is to get paid, I'm not gonna lie. Get out. I worked on, you know the top 10 list worst video games ever? Like, I mean, I can tell you some of the great games I worked on, you know, Aladdin, Metroid Prime, Tony Hawk's, the Spider-Man stuff, some Sonic games, you know, some great, you know, Earthworm Jim, great stuff, right? That's the ones I talk about. But you know how they have the top shittiest games ever of all time, you know? They have like a top 10 list. I got about 3 of those as well. The Color Dinosaur, Aquaman, I worked on it. Yeah.
What do you think caused the short life of the laser disc?
Short life of the laser disc? Yeah, I mean, you know, like Dragon's Lair came out, freaking phenomenal success. First 50-cent game, right? First game to have a monitor on top of the thing because the crowds were so big, people wanted to see it. And then Space Ace came out, and Space Ace was pretty cool as well too. And then when they did Dragon's Lair 2, how many people have played Dragon's Lair 2? I mean, probably in this room quite a bit, but not really. I mean, we're at the Classic Gaming Expo. All you people should have raised your hand, right? But I got like 5 hands. So, you know, I think it was, and then Space Ace 2, it kind of like tanked. It really tanked after Dragon's Lair. I mean, I think it was, you know, the fact that it really wasn't controlled. You know, you weren't really controlling, you know, you were just like clicking and then watching a cinematic, clicking, watching a cinematic. All you had to do was, you know, memorize where you're going and when, you know? And so I think, again, when it first came out, it was like, oh my God, this is amazing, because you were controlling a cartoon. But then it just like quickly fell off. It's like, okay, we did that now what, you know? So I just think, you know, I mean, the thing I remember You know, the first video game I ever owned was a Coleco Telstar in 1975, and I was 7 years old, and I can remember still like turning the dial. It was basically a Pong rip-off. Turning the dial and oh my God, I'm controlling my television, right? I mean, all of us in this room probably had that experience, right? You couldn't believe it, and you're controlling this thing on screen. Dragon's Lair wasn't really that. You know, that was the fun of video games. It's like, oh my God, whether you're controlling a little tank or Dragon's Lair was just boop, watch something, boop, and I love it. Don't get me wrong, it was phenomenal. One of my, major points of my childhood was going to Showbiz Pizza Place and playing Dragon's Lair all day. Yeah, I would say that. I'd probably have to say the interactivity just wasn't there, Questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I know you were saying earlier that you thought about the percentage of songs now versus the old games, and how the quality is about the same, like 95 or
the
better.
Music writing is, I would say, the same quality. Yeah.
But, you think in those earlier systems, the limitations like the short sustain maybe like pushed you to make stronger melodies?
Totally. That's it. Exactly. Again, when you had only 3 voices, that's all you had was melody. It better be good, or else it was going to be annoying and grating, right? So yeah, in the focus, that's why I always tell composers these days, and when I compose music, I pretend like I'm composing 25 years ago, right? I want to, it's all about melody. So forget about the live orchestras, forget about all this stuff. Because if you have a great motif, a hook, right? That Mario melody, right? I mean, you could put it in anything. Go on ocremix.org, right? You can hear a heavy metal version, a jazz version, a symphony version, a reggae version. I mean, once you have that hook, you can do anything to it, right? And you can make it slow, you can make it scary, you can record it with a live orchestra, you record it with a jazz band, it still sounds cool. So so that's what I always tell younger composers too, is always pretend like you only have 3 voices, right? Yeah, that's exactly the reason why I was a lot more melodic back then. Game music now isn't as melodic because everyone's, so worried about, oh, we got to bring the oboe player in and make sure we make good use of the timpani, It's like, just focus on the melody, Yo.
When you were working on games like in the early 90s that were on different systems.
Yeah.
Did you do all your own conversions?
Yeah, no, that sucked. Yeah, great question. So he asked, when I was working on games in the early 90s, did I have to convert them all myself and this and that? And yeah, that was a problem. Sometimes, most of the times I did, because if you sent them off to somebody else, because there were other companies out there who would do it for you, and it would take a lot. It was like, whew, yeah, I don't have to worry about that. But it would always screw it up. And not to their fault, it's just that, again, it was different systems, like, oh man, can't they tell that the kick drum isn't supposed to be that loud, And so it was, yeah, once you would write, and me personally, I preferred to write on the Genesis. So like Earthworm Jim and all those games, I wrote it on the Genesis first and then converted it to the Super Nintendo. Even though the Super Nintendo had more voices, I would rather add to stuff than have to like write it on the Super Nintendo and then take 2 voices away for the Genesis. And again, I just liked the sound of the Genesis better. It was a punchier, more analog FM synth sound. So yeah, once you wrote it on the Genesis, it's like, okay, now we got to do it on the Super Nintendo. It's like, ugh. I had the MIDI file to start with, and then I get my shit out of luck files from Nintendo 2 months later, and then I had to start to like, oh man, but this bass sound really sucks. Let me send some more bass samples up to Nintendo and get them back in a couple more months and try to put them in there, So it was really slow for me. You don't want to be doing that, when you're trying to create music. So that's why I would always go on the Genesis first and then convert over. But yeah, it would sometimes take like 2 or 3 months just to convert over to, to the other system. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So it makes me that it seems like with music, you're not taking as much advantage of positional audio. So it seems like the bands are always together in one place.
Right, positional audio. He's saying for modern music, because all the systems we have now are like 5.1, right? The problem with that, we did a lot of messing around with this as well, is that like you know, when you have 5.1 audio, you could, if you had a symphony, for example, you could put your string players kind of around here, you could put your brass over here, your choir over here, and kind of all around you, right? And the problem is that when you're in a 3D environment, and some games you could do that with, like maybe a fighting game where you didn't have to really move around too much, but most like 3D games, when you move around, you know, you really want the sound effects, the sound design to have the 3D positioning. Because when you have to worry about volumes all the time, it's better if your music is just straight up left and right in the center. I'll give you an example. A game I worked on called Maximo. It was like the reboot of the Ghost and Goblin series. We had this one big airship, and it was kind of like the boss level, right? And so we had the music playing, but then the idea was that you had to take out, there were 4 pillars on the left and 4 pillars on the right. And you had to like take each one of those out, and they were big generators. So when I would take, so now you have to represent, you have to have a generator sound attached to every single one of the 8 generators. So that's a sound, that's like, you know, that's a big thing. And then you have your volume of your music. Once you take one of them out, and then you take 2 out, 3 out, 4 out, 5 out, the volume starts to drop really, really low, and now the music's too loud. And then the balance is all screwed up. So you constantly have to like think about what is the balance of the game, you know, and the music. And then when you have to, so when you're moving around this world and now it's behind you and there's an enemy behind you and you want the person to know, you don't want the trumpet on your ass behind you screwing shit up for you, you know? So that's one thing that you have to be careful about. I'll give you another example, funny story. When I was working on Madden football, and this is on the Genesis and Super Nintendo in the early 90s, I remember the producer came up to me and he's like, yeah, this year we want to do something really cool. We want to have like footstep sounds for like every single player on the field. So that when you say hike, you kind of get that, you know, that noise of, you know, it's all, and it'll sound like really cool. Sounds like a fantastic idea, doesn't it? We're like, yeah, let's try that. Okay, cool. So here's what it sounded like. 43, 43, hut, hut, hut. And like, you know, 20 people all, so you can't do that. So what you got to figure out is, okay, what we'll do is we'll give the footstep sound to the quarterback, whoever had the ball, and the closest person next to him in the thing. That's how we'll do it. So whoever had the ball had the sound effect. So when you were running around, it's right? And then when you had the closest person, enemy to you, we have their sound effect as well. So that kind of made it more, you know, palatable for the ear. When you do sound effects, like footstep sounds, a perfect example. When I do a game, I'll have probably 3,000 or 4,000 footstep sounds just in one game. Because what you want to do is, you want to have, okay, well, first of all, there's boots, there's sneakers, there's barefoot, there's high heels, there's all sorts of different kinds of shoes, and there's all sorts of different kinds of surfaces. You got wood, you have carpet, you have tile, you have grass, you have dirt, you have water, you have snow, and every one of those combinations for every one, surfaces and foot. You want to mix it up, and you also have you want to randomize them. So you don't want to just have one footstep sound playing every time. You know, Resident Evil did that. It was the most awful thing ever. You know, same footstep sound every freaking time, right? So I would record like 10 different footstep sounds, and then randomly tell the programmer, say, look, when he makes a step, sneaker on wood, here's 10 different sounds, randomly play one of them every time, and then throw that one out and randomly play one of the other ones, and until it goes through the series. So it's always random, and then randomize the pitch, so he put it a little higher and a little lower, and randomize the volume as well. Because no one walks the same every time, but that's what a video game sounds like a lot of times if they don't do it right? So it has to be all these little subtle things that you do. So same thing with gunshots. You know, you want same gunshot sound, recorded 100 different times, and then subtleties to it. Are we getting booted?
Yeah, we're getting close on
We're
time.
getting close. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Maybe one more question. Yeah. One more question, and I'll go out there too, and if anyone has any others. Is that it? Oh, one more, last question. Here we go.
I just wondered if you can recall an early game that got you interested in doing music. Because for me, I do music part-time, but something like Ultima 3 on the Atari.
Right.
Medieval kind of stuff.
So was there a game that kind of got me into music? I'll tell you, one of the first games I remember there was two of them actually, and it's going to sound weird, but I remember when I first played Xevious, and this was the music to Xevious, and that was it for the whole game. But it was like, that was kind of interesting to me. I don't know why, but to me it was Pac-Man too. Like Pac-Man was the first music that I actually like remembered that had a melody, and the cutscenes were like doodle doo doo doo, I was like, oh wow, you know, right? I think that was Miss Pac-Man. Anyway, but you know, that was the kind of stuff that I think I remember. Like it was melodic and it stuck, and I was like, wow, you can have music in video games, because before then it was Space Invaders, right? Dun 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 dun. 4 notes, you're done. Asteroids, 2 notes, you're done. Dun, 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 you're done, right? So, actually, interesting thing about Space Invaders. The guy who programmed Space Invaders had a great privilege to meet and talk to the guy for a while. He programmed Space Invaders. He started with the heartbeat. So it was like bum, 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 right? He started with somebody's heartbeat, and then what he found is that when you know, you started taking out the ships and they got closer and closer, and the heartbeat sound, dun, 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 the faster it got, they were actually doing tests with people's heart rate, and the sound was changing their heart rate. So when you play Space Invaders, think about that for a second. You're playing it, and you're kind of like all relaxed at first, and then by the end of it, when that last guy's going, you're like, fuck, you know, ah! And your heart rate is beating, and it had not only for the visual, but because of the audio, and he did that on purpose, so really cool. All right, thanks everybody. Yeah, rock on. I'll be out here if anyone wants to say hi. Thank you.